Head hunger are cravings. Cravings they come on quite suddenly, and they might be triggered by eye hunger, so seeing food, hearing food like a crisp packet being opened, walking past a bakery and smelling it. Heart hunger is your emotions. So for example, you're feeling happy, sad, frustrated. And then stomach hunger is like that true hunger which tends to build.
That was dietitian Nichola Ludlam-Rain talking about the 3 different types of hunger: your head, your heart, and your stomach. Very important topic for anyone that identifies as an emotional eater. I think we all have at some point. I definitely have. And bringing awareness to where is that hunger coming from towards the back end of that episode. In today's podcast, we talk all things ultra-processed food, some of the misconceptions that people have. And if you've ever labeled all processed foods into the bad category, we unpack some of the misinformation and how they're not all created equal in today's episode. Nichola puts out a lot of evidence-supported, research-backed content on our social media channels, and we talk through how to navigate some of the misinformation that you might see online when it comes to dietary advice, from oats being good for you versus oats being bad for you versus smoothies being good for you versus being bad, and how to have context depending and make an informed choice in your nutrition so you can find what's going to work best for you. Today's podcast is also sponsored and brought to you by my BKF online program. If you have been a long-term listener to the podcast or have read any of my books, particularly the Fitness Mindset or the Keen Edge, my 2 nutrition books, you know that I'm a big believer in finding a nutritional plan that fits into your lifestyle and schedule, that includes foods that you enjoy and that's in alignment with your goals. That's what I do in my BKF online program. And then I put a training program alongside that based on your level, and then coaching with me in the accountability and check-ins. If that's something you're interested in and you're on a weight loss journey, a body composition journey, looking to lose body fat, build muscle, potentially do them both at the same time, check the link in the description. Also, if you're listening to this podcast on Spotify, if you could leave a rating, that would be amazing. It helps massively with the growth of the show and allows me to bring other great guests like Nichola on to the podcast to help you on your journey. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, you can leave a rating and a review. I would try and read all of those. There's no try. I do read all of those reviews, particularly all the ones that come up on my phone. If you're outside of Ireland, I don't get all of those, but a review would be massively appreciated. Again, helps with the growth of the show, that allows me to support you on your journey. So without further ado, here is today's podcast with dietitian Nichola Ludlam-Rain on the real problem with ultra-processed food, eating healthy and not losing weight, and the 3 types of hunger: head, heart, and stomach. Enjoy. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today with my guest, Nichola Ludlam-Rain. Nichola is a specialist registered dietitian with over 15 years of clinical experience working for the NHS as well as privately. She shares inspiring content to over 100,000 followers on social media and has appeared on TV multiple times. Nichola is a regular on BBC Breakfast, ITV Tonight, and Channels 4 and 5, and regularly provides commentary to numerous tabloids and press outlets. She advocates for a better relationship with food so that others can build healthier habits that lead to lasting change. She is also the author of the new book, How Not to Eat Ultra Processed, your 4-week plan for life-changing healthier habits. I'm looking forward to talking all things processed food, health and nutrition in today's show. Nichola, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
Nichola, let's jump off with the new book. Why ultra processed food? Because this is something that people have a little bit of an awareness around when it comes to, I probably should eat more healthy, quote unquote, nutrient dense food. I should avoid processed food completely, although some of us are pulled to it. You ask one person, is a protein bar processed? Somebody else is like, oh, it's not. Someone else will say it's ultra processed. It's a very nuanced topic that I'm really excited to explore. But talk to us for your reasoning why you went in the direction of writing a book around ultra processed food.
Exactly like you said, the whole topic is so nuanced and it's so confusing that even when I started writing the book, I had to do some serious digging and speaking to colleagues about how to convey this information without being scaremongering and how to make it really practical. Because even as a dietitian of 15 years, the word ultra processed is not necessarily a term that I've been using until fairly recently. You know, we might know it as junk foods or high fat foods or high sugar foods. However, ultra-processed foods takes it that one step further. And I think the confusion lies because actually there are some pretty healthy, in my eyes, and nutrient-dense foods that are also UPFs, so ultra-processed foods. And that's why I was so passionate about writing a book that was simple to follow. It breaks it down. What are UPFs and what does it mean for you and your family at home on a day-to-day basis?
What would be a layman's term description for processed food versus ultra processed food?
Good question. Most foods are processed. So processed foods encompass any sort of processing. It might be at home, it might be toasting some bread, it might be washing an apple, freezing a garden pea. So most, I would say 99% of foods that we eat are processed to make them safe and edible. Ultra processed then, it's foods which have been produced in a manufacturing environment, and they contain perhaps a concoction of ingredients, most of which you may not find in a regular typical kitchen. So for example, like emulsifiers, flavorers, artificial sweeteners, colors, preservatives, these ingredients that keep things looking fresh on the shop shelf, so you wouldn't be able to create a UPF at home. And there is a lot of questions around, is the addition of natural flavorings to a product, for example, does that make it a UPF? In my eyes, it depends on what else is in the food. So looking at the ingredients list, if it's mainly nuts and dried fruit, then in my eyes, it's not. But if you've got a load of emulsifiers, preservatives, then yeah, it's probably a UPF.
Nichola, let's open Pandora's box early. What is the biggest misconception you see when it comes to ultra-processed foods?
I think the biggest misconception is that you need to avoid all UPFs to be healthy. And actually, I'm a very grounded dietitian, and I believe that all foods, no matter what they are, can fit within a healthy and balanced diet. The key is the portion size and the frequency in which you eat all foods. So what matters most when it comes to your health is, what are you eating the majority of the time? And then the odd UPF is absolutely fine. Now, what I said at the start, the biggest misconception is that all UPFs are almost like on a level playing field, where they're not. And this is the premise behind the book, in that UPFs are on a spectrum of health. You can get UPFs, for example, Skittles and Mars bars, which are high in fat, high in sugar, lots of artificial sweeteners, and low on the nutrition profile, low in micronutrients, low in fiber. On the other hand, though, you've got your fish fingers, things like wholemeal bread, baked beans, which provide lots of nutrients, protein, plant-based protein, fiber, vitamins, minerals. They are classed as a UPF. But in my eyes, you cannot bundle those two groups of foods together. So that's where the nuance lies. And that's why I wanted the book to be written, to convey that, you can have more of the healthy UPFs than the others.
One of the philosophies that we sing very similar hymn sheets on is that there's no food that's good or bad. There's food that's nutrient dense, there's food that's nutrient devoid of nutrients, there's food that's high in calories, low in calories. And something I've regularly told people I've worked with in programs is, broccoli's not going to save you from a burn in a building, and chocolate bar is not going to stab you down a back alley. There's no good or bad food. We project our morals onto the food. It's very context dependent. I'm curious, when it comes to UPFs and ultra processed foods in general, you mentioned there about healthy, and a misconception a lot of people have is the fork in the road between health and fitness, because they're two very different things. You can be extremely healthy and not necessarily fit, and I would argue, as a person that was a quote-unquote ab selfie wanker in the early days on Instagram with lots of selfies and lots of ab shirtless photos, I was in a very unhealthy state around that time, 2015, 2014, but I was very lean, I was very muscular, but I was eating a lot of highly processed foods. Can you talk to us a little bit about the role ultra-processed foods play in health versus just fitness, where you'd have people just calorie counting, trying to hit their macros, but not necessarily looking at the nutrient density in the foods?
Yeah, great question. So health encompasses a lot of things. It's physical health, it's our mental health, it's also our emotional well-being, our relationships with foods. And like you said just before, I too believe that all foods can fit. For example, your soul foods, if you remove those foods that, for example, things like birthday cake or, might be chocolate from someone's diet, they would probably have a poorer quality of life, which may reflect on their overall health. The problem lies if people are relying on UPFs on a day-to-day basis. And for example, if 80% of their diet consists of these foods that are high in UPF, they are calorie dense, most of them, they're quite moreish. They're often displacing foods that have more nutrients in them. So if you've got a very high UPF diet, the research shows that you may be more likely to be of a higher BMI, maybe have diabetes, high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, mortality. However, when you actually look at the evidence, Most of the trials are of poor quality, so better research is needed. And some of them didn't take into account things like, well, body mass index, smoking, socioeconomic status, which can all influence our health. So actually, when you break it down that way, these UPFs may not have the influence that we're seeing. And also new research is now emerging saying that these healthier, quote unquote, UPFs, for example, higher fiber wholemeal bread, more nutrient dense, they may not be associated with those negative health outcomes that I've just said because of their health properties. So even though they may contain some emulsifiers, their benefits and their positive profile, the fiber in them, it outweighs any negatives. My philosophy though is that if you've got a food that you eat on a day-to-day basis and there's a simple swap to making it, for example, emulsifier free, for example, bread's a really easy one to do, brands like Jason's or even like own brand sourdough, which aren't as expensive, maybe make that swap. And, especially if you've got kids and they're eating it day in, day out. However, there are caveats. For example, I feed my kids Weetabix over shredded wheat. Weetabix is a UPF because of there's one ingredient. The ingredient slips my mind right now, but it's fortified. So Weetabix contains iron, whereas shredded wheat doesn't. So I choose to feed my kids Weetabix, and then I'll try and buy a bread without emulsifiers in. So it's all about a balance. What does your diet and lifestyle looks like, and what foods are you eating?
You've indirectly answered what was going to be my next question, but I'm going to get you to add on to it potentially. And that was, what are some of the foods that jump out at you that people are generally wrong about? And again, wrong is a very semantic based approach in terms of context matters greatly. But you mentioned bread there, you mentioned Weetabix being fortified in iron, etc. When you think of ultra processed foods and people, and something like nutrition is so gray and it's very easy to put a black and white, good or bad thinking and label onto it. But when people have, well, that food is quote unquote bad, or that food is highly processed, I'm not going near it, when in reality, such as the Weetabix example, depending on the context, might be a better alternative. What other foods jump to mind when I say that?
Yeah, and do you know what? No foods are like good and bad. Exactly what you said. Foods don't hold a moral value. It's us which does that, which actually can be pretty bad, because I've seen it in my weight loss clinics when I used to work for the NHS. If people say that things are good or bad, I had a bad food, it can lead to this binge restrict cycle. But I'll give you an example of foods that I have in my kitchen. So yeah, there's Weetabix, and I just remembered that ingredient. It's barley malt extract. So that ingredient makes a food quite easy to eat, and unfortunately it makes it a UPF. We do have some breads with emulsifiers in, I've checked. We have baked beans. Some of my hummus technically is classed as UPF. And we decided to shop at Aldi about a couple of years ago, just because of the cost savings in comparison to the other supermarkets. So my husband now, he does the weekly shop. And do you know what? Like, I'm not going to nitpick on these foods, because we've got loads of fresh fruit and vegetables, and we've got things like rice and potatoes. So I know that the majority of our diet is non-UPF. We've got meats, fish, eggs. So if I'm going to have those handful of foods, and, also we've got things like ice cream and dark chocolate. Sometimes it might be emulsifier free. Sometimes it might have soy lecithin in. In my eyes, the addition of soy lecithin doesn't make that a strongly non-nutritious UPF food, because I've got antioxidants and flavonoids in it. So like I said, it's all on a spectrum. So I talk about the 80-20 rule. I would put the 80% of what I eat, kind of like the whole foods, my baked beans and Weetabix, into that 80%. And then 20% would be the less nutrient dense UPFs. Like, for example, a tub of Ben & Jerry's. At the weekend it was hot. I had a Mars bar ice cream and I really loved it. I think I had 2. But I don't have that every single day. So it's what you have the majority of the time that matters.
Well, I agree with you there. I think Ben & Jerry's and Mars ice cream are the staple of any good freezer for sure, just not every day. I want to partly park on that and talk about some of the main disadvantages of eating a lot of highly processed foods or ultra processed foods. And I'm using myself as an example, but there's a lot of people listening to this podcast who will be similar, where fitness would have been a higher goal than health. And if you look at my nutrition in 2014, 2015, I was walking around very lean. I was walking around quite muscular. I was doing a lot of fitness modeling and bodybuilding shows and things that were very aesthetic based. But I was eating a lot of processed foods, lots of protein bars, lots of protein shakes, a lot of ready-made chicken meals, things along those lines. But I was able to control the calories, control the macros. So I was relatively lean. So the main disadvantage I found was my energy levels were terrible. Like I would wake up tired, I would go to bed tired, and I never seemed to get an enhancement in energy through the day unless it was stimulant based. What is the main disadvantage that you tend to see with people who are eating too many ultra processed foods?
Exactly like he said, it's about what they're not eating. So if you're fueling your day on these UPFs, well, what is that in replace of? So I've got nothing against, for example, a protein shake or a protein bar. If you need to reach your protein goals and you want to be lean and you want to add in a protein shake, that's fine. However, if you're fueling your day, then where are the whole grains? Whole grains, for example, provide B vitamins, which convert the food that we eat into energy. We need fiber to help keep our gut moving so you're not feeling sluggish. Are you eating your vitamin C from your 5 a day? Are you getting, for example, unsaturated fats, your omega-3, so 2 portions of fish a week, one of which is oily. So all of these whole foods provide not only an array of nutrients, but it's the matrix and it's how our body extrapolates and absorbs these nutrients that matters most. So somebody might be having, for example, like these protein shakes, protein bars, and maybe popping a multivitamin, thinking that they're reaching the recommended nutrient intakes. But actually, is your body able to absorb that? And are you hitting 30 grams of fiber? Likely not, because these protein shakes and protein bars are pretty low in fiber, and often they're high in sweeteners. I've got nothing against sweeteners per se, but some of them do cause a little bit of gut upset in some people. They might cause bloating. So perhaps that's why you were feeling sluggish. And yeah, maybe your body at that time was not getting all of the micronutrients that it needed.
We have a mutual friend, Kirsten, who's been on the podcast recently, the IBS dietitian, and sweeteners are one of those things that I'm very similar to you. I always look at the evidence, and for those who have issues with their gut microbiome, a history of IBS, etc., need to be very mindful of sweeteners. For others, again, there's arguments that there might be potential carcinogenics or might cause cancer. We don't know. Those studies haven't been done. They haven't been out long enough yet, and anyone that says otherwise they're not basing it off evidence. So again, everything is going to be dependent on, well, what does the evidence say? What does the research say? And when it comes to anything along those lines, your fiber intake, that's been so well documented in studies that we need to be hitting our fiber recommendation. And this is actually something I see more often than people struggling with their protein requirements, is actually hitting their fiber requirements per day. And in a lot of cases, as someone that comes from a fitness background, people think that I'm like, okay, bump up your protein. And some people do, but in a lot of cases, it's actually, well, let's look at your fiber. If you're not having a regular bowel movement once or twice a day, and you've been constipated regularly for 2, 3, 4 days in a row, and that happens every week, there might be an issue with your hydration levels or your fiber intake. So look at that first. I'm curious, Nichola, because you have such a great history with helping people with the NHS in the weight loss clinics, as you mentioned earlier. What's a mistake that you tend to see people who have a weight loss or a fat loss goal? For example, I would imagine it's possibly the opposite to what we see. Something that is very common on my side is people eating healthy and not losing weight, where they're like, I'm eating a lot of nutrient-dense foods, I'm eating a lot of complex carbohydrates, healthy fats, complete proteins, but their calories are just way too high. And yes, I'm all for health, longevity, you're going to feel better, but if you're hitting 1,000, 1,500 calories over what you need every day, it doesn't matter if it's coming from chicken, broccoli, and rice, it's still not going to help you with a weight loss goal. What was, and I might be wrong, maybe it was similar what you saw, but with the weight loss clinics in particular, what were some of the common mistakes you regularly saw?
Do you know what? It's so hard, isn't it? It's about striking that balance, between eating to live and living to eat and then hitting all these goals. But it can be done. And I think a really easy example, similar to what you've just mentioned, is, for example, healthy fats. So people hear that fats are good for you. So then they might have had a heart attack. They need to increase unsaturated fats. They start using lots of olive oil, start snacking on things like nuts, which unfortunately, so nuts or fats contain 9 calories per gram in comparison to protein and carbs, which are 4 calories per gram, which means that they're very energy dense. And I do remember seeing some people in clinic and they're saying to me, I'm not eating much, but I'm still gaining weight. And if people have got a high fat diet, it doesn't matter if it's of the preferred fat, the healthier fats, calories are calories, and they will stop a weight loss goal unless you are in a calorie deficit. So I love that example of what you said, the difference between like fitness and health. And I think often after bariatric surgery, people can sometimes get a little bit obsessed with calories and protein at the expense of their overall nutrition goals. You know, why have you had weight loss surgery? Yes, it might have been to do with aesthetics, but also it was health. And unless you're healthy, you're not going to be feeling good, and you're not going to be reducing your risk of cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and things that go with it. So I think definitely being mindful of fats. People get very confused over sugar. So I think sometimes people can get a little bit obsessed with it. And it's about saying, look, a little bit of added sugar is okay, but also things like fresh fruit. I would much rather people eat fresh fruit than having a 1 liter bottle of smoothie, which I remember like one patient did, and they thought they were being really good. They'd heard that, having fruit was good for them. So, limiting fruit juice and fruit smoothies bought from the shop to like 150 mils a day, because it can encourage something called passive overconsumption. So the overconsumption of calories without realizing it. So that's what traditional UPFs can do, but also things that are highly processed like smoothies and fruit juices. So these foods have got what we call a health halo on. So they are marketed as being really healthy, but actually when you look at it, it's to do with the portion size. And actually some of them classically, I think it was marshmallows, they're labeled as fat-free. Like that in my eyes should be illegal. Yes, they are legally fat-free, but they're mega high in sugar. So that's creating a false health halo. I remember at uni, I studied sports science at Loughborough, and I remember eating a packet of sweets, saying to my friend, before I knew anything about nutrition, these are okay because they're fat-free. Like I actually remember saying that. And now obviously, I might have sweets once in a blue moon, but it's the sugar content. So it's the balance.
One of my biggest pet peeves, and even as you're saying it now, it still comes up, is when people would switch their yogurts for the low-fat yogurts that were ramped up in sugar, because you can bring the calories down. It's just basic math. As you mentioned earlier, there's 9 kilocalories per every gram of fat. There's 4 kilocalories for every gram of carbohydrate. So you can have more sugar, make it tastier, and actually bring the calories down and quote-unquote make it fat-free. That was historically, and it's less so now, thankfully. I have other pet peeves when it comes to nutrition now, but that was one historically that was there. What is a pet peeve that you have at the minute, Nichola, that you see regularly, probably online, because I think online is a vehicle for misinformation. Unfortunately, it's why it's so important to be following pages like yours, where you're giving the evidence, you're giving the research, you're letting people know, look, these are the facts, make your own decisions based on the information, versus somebody just looking for a clickbait headline that is actually very harmful when it comes to education. What is your current pet peeve that you see online?
I don't want to mention any names, GG, but I think it's people who create health anxieties, and maybe they're creating content for the worried well, but it's not actually helping anybody. So for example, saying that oranges are unnatural is not helpful. The other side of it, as well as these people creating health anxieties, it's the trends, especially on TikTok. I'm not personally on TikTok, but I think it's a pet peeve, and I'm worried about the younger generation. So it's preying on the vulnerable, like the oat Zempic trend, and even people on the other flip side, fear-mongering oats. Like the mind boggles. And actually, it's just sprung to mind my biggest pet peeve, which it didn't spring to mind at first. People going into supermarkets and reeling off ingredients lists as though there's something wrong with them. However, to the watcher with the untrained ears, it sounds really evil. They're saying rapeseed oil this, and I'm like, there's nothing actually that, there's nothing wrong with rapeseed oil. And also I think that what goes on in America versus the UK is very different. So maybe people looking into certain things, whether it's to do with dairy or oil, and then thinking that it applies to the UK market, and actually it doesn't, because we've got very different regulations. So think like, that's a massive pet peeve. So people who don't really know what they're going on about, creating these clickbait headlines, especially on TikTok, and then worrying the even more worried well on Instagram.
That's so funny. It reminds me, I was doing a radio appearance there about 2 months ago, and a woman came up to me. She's like, "Oh, I follow you online." I was like, "Oh, amazing." She goes, "What's the story with oats?" And I was like, I don't know. What's the story with oats? She was like, "You could tell me, what's the story with oats?" As if it was this like secret. And I was like, "Yeah, they're great. High in fiber, complex carb." No, I heard they're really bad for me. I was like, "Who told you that?" She's like, "I saw it on TikTok." And I was like, "Do you know what? Have your bowl of oats in the morning. I love them. They're high in fiber. They're a complex carb. You're not going to go too wrong with them." And I remember thinking, wow, the amount of unhelpful information, and it confuses people. But this is part of the problem. And I'm aware that I do this as well. And again, I won't put your words into it, Nichola, because you're very good with this. But something that can be an issue is navigating some of that noise online, because even if I'm chatting to another nutritionist or another dietitian, one person will say, "Look, avoid rapeseed oil. This is what the studies say." Somebody else will say, "Look, rapeseed oil is perfectly fine." Same as oats. You have somebody that, like me, who's like, "Look, I'm a big fan. It's a complex carb. It's high in fiber. I like it. The research is good." But you'll have somebody else that will find something wrong with it, similar to the oranges. How do you recommend people navigate some of that noise online? Because my advice in the past has been to pick 2 or 3 people who you devoutly trust, and then mute or unfollow the other accounts where it comes to where you're getting your nutrition. And I might be one of those accounts. You might be one of those accounts that they follow and they go, "Right, I'm going to listen to what Nichola has to say, and I'm going to follow 2 other people, and that's it." I block out all the other noise. Otherwise, you get drowned in information when you're starved for knowledge. How do you recommend people navigate some of that noise online so they're not getting all this confusion around nutrition in general?
Yeah, do you know what? It's really hard, because a lot of these accounts that are springing to mind that do cause confusion, actually 50% of what they put out is either harmless or actually it's quite useful. They might be sharing healthy recipes. But then my inbox is filled with people saying like, "Nichola, what do you think to this? What do you think to this?" And exactly, it goes back to the oats thing. I think the first time I heard that somebody was trying to say that oats were bad for you, I couldn't work out like where the rationale was coming from. So I think it's a case of, yep, you could definitely like unfollow these people. The first thing is to look at, well, what are their like qualifications and are they regulated? And I mean, for example, like dietitians, you can get good and bad dietitians. You can get dietitians who are au fait with the evidence and maybe others that are not. However, on the whole, dietitians have to give evidence-based advice. Whereas, for example, maybe a nutritionist can be used by anyone. Their qualifications may be questionable. So if they are a nutritionist, maybe just ask them, like, what are your qualifications? Like, are you regulated by anyone? And if you are puzzled at what someone's saying, you can ask them, like, where is the evidence? And the thing is, anybody can cherry pick any data. I've forgotten the guy who I really like in the US, who he always says, randomized control trials. Do you know who I mean? The guy who'll come to mind. Anybody can give you a little study that supports what they're saying, but where are the systematic reviews? Where are the big bodies of evidence that support? So yeah, I would say that. And often if it sounds too good to be true, or if there are any red flags like never eat this again, then you really want to be questioning all of the advice that person's saying. And often I read books where I will take like maybe 80% of it and then the rest with a pinch of salt. So I think it's about like the more you listen to maybe credible people, the more able that you're able to do that with other people's content.
Yeah, I think it depends on what stage of your journey you're at. The yous of the world and the me's of the world who would be considerably less regulated when it comes to the nutritional advice I offer. All of mine was sports nutrition, all certified, qualification based, not registered dietitian. You're not allowed to say things or else there's consequences. And that's why I think it's really important for people to know that you're going to have the Nicholas of the world putting out the research and the evidence, because it's part of what you do and it's part of how you're regulated. And that's a really important distinguishment for people to know, or awareness to have, that if you're following somebody on social, and this isn't to knock anyone, I think people are doing the best they can with the information they have, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be helpful for you. So you have to put boundaries in place and protect where your information is coming from. And something that I found really helpful when it comes to nutrition, And this is what I try and do with people I work with. It's what I try and do on this podcast, is giving them basic principles to work from, because ultimately you can cherry pick, as you mentioned, evidence to support anything you say when it comes to nutrition for the most part, if you go deep enough. If you had 1, 2, or 3 nutritional principles that you like people to look at, Nichola, what would be the priority or the order that you would put them in?
I would say, firstly, try to eat more whole foods. So whether that's fruit, vegetables, whole grains, lean meat, fish, eggs. So try and base your diet on whole foods. The second is, when it comes to drinks, make sure that the majority of them are sugar-free. And when it comes to caffeine, keep your caffeine to before 2 or 3 o'clock, because you don't want it impacting on your sleep, because sleep is crucial for making positive decisions about what you eat. And then I think thirdly, to make your life easier, whenever you're making a meal, cook once, eat twice. So just always make more than what you need. And going back to principle 1, can you add some kidney beans in there? Can you add some spices? So more plants and more color, the better. And then just make your life easier for your future self. So I would say like those 3 principles are a really good starting point. And then, finally a little bit of what you fancy does you good. Yeah. And just be careful where you get your evidence from. Like what I was saying, it's not just about following people who are regulated. It's about me being a good dietitian by saying, do you know what? FODMAPs is not my area. I'm not an IBS dietitian. I can give you first and second line advice, but you want to go to Kirsten for that. Or it's like me saying, I'm not an allergy specialist dietitian. Yes, I'm an allergy mum and I can give you my advice, but I can't give the up-to-date evidence. And I think that's what makes a really good practitioner, a good registered nutritionist, a good dietitian, when they not only stay in their lane, but they say, do you know what? Like, I know personally a lot about, for example, like weight loss and public health and diabetes, like maternal obesity, but I don't know, about the rest of it. I don't know about ICU dietetics because I did that over 10 years ago. So it's about referring on. So when you've got someone who holds their hands up and says, do you know what? I actually need to know more about that subject. Let's go and speak to so-and-so. You've got a really good practitioner. Because I've forgotten that. What's that effect where the more you know, the more you realize that you don't know? However, charlatans and quacks, they appear to know it all. And I think when I was first starting out, it almost blew my mind. I think I thought I was a really bad dietitian because I didn't know it all. But actually, no, like, you're a good dietitian by kind of like focusing on your area and being good within your clinical expertise.
That's great advice, Nichola. And I see a common trend. Kirsten was the same. I've had Rhiannon Lambert on the podcast. I've had other registered dietitians who will say, this is my lane. This is what I know. And one, are good at referring people on, but also will always say, look, this is what the evidence says, or this is what the research says. You need to try this on. And if you have somebody, because I've also had those people on the podcast, I won't name any names, who are like, no, this is the answer. This is the answer. This is the food answer. This is the training answer. And like, you're always trying to be nice and just push back in a nice, gentle way. But I always tell people, similar to you, when someone says there's this one size fits all approach with anything diet or training related without giving context, that's normally a bit of a red flag. So just be aware of that with consuming podcasts, social media, TikTok, Instagram, etc. Pulling it back to UPFs, in the book, you go through a 4-week plan on how people can get themselves ready and reduce back some of their UPFs. And I won't go through this because people can check out the book further as they've got week 1, week 2, week 3, which goes through breakfast, lunch, dinners, evening meals, etc. But for those who are listening now, who want to go from 0 to 1, who are thinking, actually, I eat quite a lot of highly processed foods or ultra processed foods, and my energy levels haven't been great. I'm not feeling very good. And I'm a believer, and have been historically, to nutrient density in food, which should increase your energy, which if you're working out leads to better workouts, which either leads to more calories being burnt if you're doing cardiovascular activity, or more lean muscle tissue being built, which will increase your metabolic rate. So you'll burn more calories while you're resting, which is the real long-term secret for things like body composition, weight loss, and fat loss change. But for those who want to go 0 to 1 to increase their energy levels by removing or reducing UPFs, what would be that strategy for getting up and running?
I would say the very first step is to be your own diet detective and do a food diary for at least 3 days, ideally a week. Write down everything that you eat and drink, where you are, how you're feeling. I talk about in the book head hunger, which is cravings, heart hunger, which is emotions, stomach hunger, and figure out what are you eating and why, because that's going to be the basis of where do you go from there. So for example, are you eating a packet of biscuits mid-afternoon because your lunch consisted of tomato soup? So there was no protein in there. There was no like whole grains, no carbohydrates. So can you add in, focus on what you need to add in first before taking away? So let's add in at lunch, and then mid-afternoon, it might just be a couple of biscuits, or it might be a herbal tea because you're still full from your lunch. So it's about being your own diet detective. And week 1 in the book, I focus on snacks and drinks because I believe that they can often make the biggest difference. For example, switching from sugary to diet is one way of reducing sugary foods, but then can you take it a step further? Can you flavor some sparkling water with some frozen berries? Can you freeze some lemon slices in some ice cubes to make tasty drinks like that? So I look at drinks, I look at snacks. Can you even just prepare your mid-morning snack? And I talk about protein and produce. So apple and cheese, carrots and hummus, yogurt and berries. The key is not to overhaul your diet all in one go. And that's why I broke it up into 4 different weeks. So the pre-plan plan is a food diary. Get to know the what's and the whys, and then you can come up with the next steps. So I would say, look at your drinks, look at your UPF drinks, and can you make any modifications around your snacks? But remember, it might be about what do you need to add in first rather than take away, because just remember that your body does not like to be deprived. If I told you, do not think of a white polar bear, then you're probably thinking about a white polar bear, so I mustn't eat UPS, I mustn't eat chocolate biscuits, I mustn't eat chocolate. It makes you want to crave it more. So let's focus on, I must drink a little bit more water, I must aim for my 5 a day, have more whole grains, ensure I'm eating enough protein, and then your UPF intake will naturally decline.
Can you explain more about the head, heart, and stomach hunger?
Yeah, it's something that I'm really passionate about. So all different types of hunger are valid, and having food, no matter what your hunger, is okay. However, it depends on the frequency in which you're responding to that hunger with food. That may not make it conducive to health. So for example, head hunger are cravings. Cravings they come on quite suddenly, and they might be triggered by eye hunger, so seeing food, hearing food like a crisp packet being opened, walking past a bakery and smelling it. Heart hunger is your emotions. So for example, you're feeling happy, sad, frustrated. And then stomach hunger is like that true hunger, which tends to build. Now, what I talk about in the book is how do you control head hunger? The main thing is your environment. So I talk about trying to make the healthy choice the easy choice. When you go into your kitchen, have you got a fruit bowl filled with healthy foods, healthy whole fruits? When you open the fridge, have you got crudités and nutritious dips at eye level? You might still have biscuits, but the biscuit tin isn't next to the kettle. It's in a little bit more of an inconvenient location to create what I call pause points. So moments of time to pause and reflect and think, do I really need that biscuit? And if you want it, fine, have it, but enjoy it mindfully as opposed to mindlessly eating it out of habit or just because the kettle's boiling. When it comes to emotional eating, when you are in a good and positive place, come up with what I call if-then coping strategies. So if I'm feeling angry, I'm going to go for a walk in nature. I'm going to remove myself from the situation. If I'm feeling lonely, I'm going to phone a friend and write it down so that food isn't the default. So occasionally emotionally eating is fine. We all do it. However, if you're doing it frequently and food, it's your only way of dealing with your emotions, then that's, it's not a good thing. So food is what we call temporary pacifier of emotions. It distracts us, it dampens down our emotions, but it doesn't really deal with them. And finally, stomach hunger. In order to control stomach hunger, ideally, I usually recommend regular and balanced meals, adequate hydration. Some people like to fast, and for some people it might be beneficial, but it's not something that I do as a blanket recommendation. So I talk about fasting in the book, and I say if people want to fast, maybe fast for 12 hours overnight and don't graze throughout the day, because our gut likes to have breaks between eating. It isn't designed to be always digesting. So that's a little summary of head, heart, and stomach hunger. So my advice to listeners would just to be curious, why are you eating that? Is it head, heart, stomach hunger? Could you satisfy that emotional need or craving in a slightly different way that might be more conducive to health?
That's so helpful for people. I think that awareness around physical hunger, emotional hunger, whether it's in your head, whether it's in your heart, whether it's in your stomach, can be enough to just create that stop, pause, or, I say generally systems over willpower is what I would use as the wording for just having your biscuits a little bit harder to reach so they're not right beside the kettle, because if it's your heart that's craving them or your head that's craving them when you're not actually hungry, I'm the first one to be like, look, have the biscuits, enjoy them, similar to the Ben & Jerry's and the Mars ice creams earlier. I'm like, nope, they should be in every freezer if you're able to control them. I'm a big fan, but it's why you're eating them, not necessarily, what's the reason for them, because those foods can be really good for your soul on occasion. Soul food, 100%.
Exactly.
With fasting, Nichola, I just want to ask your opinion on this, because this is something, and I've gaps in my knowledge on this, because I was big into fasting on the research side, and anecdotally, I would try it out on myself a lot. But most of the research has been done in men, the clinical trials. I've had Dr. Stacey Sims on the podcast as well, who does a lot of work around perimenopause and menopausal women. And it was her that brought the attention to this in the first episode we did, that most of the studies around fasting were done in men as opposed to women, either overweight or healthy. Do you have an opinion or strong opinion one way or the other when it comes to fasting for females in particular, assuming that, for men it's different because of the hormonal system and women aren't small men, so we can't apply the same criteria for men for women. What are your thoughts on fasting for women in particular?
Yeah, I mean, exactly like you said. So most of the positive research that is linked with fasting is done in men. And that's because it is so hard to control women from a randomized control point of view. When it comes to the best diet, I always say the best diet is the one that suits you and your lifestyle the most. Obviously, the Mediterranean style diet, if you're fasting or not. So my philosophy is that it's more about what you eat than when you eat. However, if women want to fast, it's about, trying something out and seeing how does your body respond. I don't see much harm in maybe fasting for 12 hours overnight, unless you are pregnant, breastfeeding, at risk of an eating disorder or disordered eating, or if you've got type 2 or type 1 diabetes and you're taking medications that might induce a low blood sugar. Because if you're in that category, then any type of fast, you need to be discussing it, with a medical professional. And it's not good to ignore hunger signals. And advice around training, if you are training and your goal is performance driven, you want muscle growth, then perhaps fasting may not be conducive, because you want to get those amino acids, you want to get the protein in, maybe a little bit before, carbohydrates for energy, definitely after. And if you're in a fasting window, then actually that fasting may be detrimental to your health goals and your physique and your strength. So yes, don't graze all throughout the day. Yes, have little gaps and breaks between eating. Ideally, don't eat overnight, because unfortunately, the data shows that especially shift workers, for example, who do have to eat overnight, they do have poorer health outcomes. So, respect your circadian rhythm, try and get up at a similar time every day, go to bed, try and have a regular meal pattern that suits you. But yeah, fasting is definitely not the elixir for most people.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Again, context dependent for those that are looking to become a bit more metabolically flexible. I think ultra marathon runners and people that might potentially be running a race for 100 miles who might not have access to food, it helps to be quite metabolically flexible in terms of your body's ability to use fat as a fuel source as opposed to glucose and carbohydrate. For those outside of that, with the exception maybe of some autophagy and longevity studies that people tend to quote regularly, It's not the elixir, definitely. It's not a one size fits all. It's not a everybody should be doing this. It's a try it out, see if it fits your lifestyle, schedule, see if it helps with your goals, performance, or body composition. And if it does, keep it. And if it doesn't, then remove it and try an alternative strategy. Nichola, I have one final question I want to ask, which would be quite a broad one for nutrition, but I'm really interested to hear your answer. But before I do that, I'm going to link out the website, the social media handles for people to follow. I'll obviously link out the book that people can go and pick up. It'll be available now when this podcast goes out. Is there anywhere else you'd like to send people off the back of this podcast before we get into the final question?
I mainly hang out on Instagram, Nick's Nutrition, NICS Nutrition. And yeah, How Not to Eat Ultra Processed is available from all good bookstores.
Amazing. I'll link those directly in the description below wherever you're listening to podcasts, and they'll be on the website on the show notes on briankeenfitness.com as well. Nichola, take this in any direction you want, and you can bring yourself back to early days in uni where you're eating a packet of sweets and going, it's fine, it's low fat. But what is something with nutrition in particular, and go in any direction you want, whether it's ultra processed foods or alternative answer that you give in terms of the area you focus on, what's something that you know now about nutrition that you wish you had known in the early days that would have benefited you massively?
I got into nutrition because I was really interested in the power of food, in particular because of my skin. So I had really bad acne, and I really wish that I knew that you couldn't trust every little snippet that you read in the media. Back then it was magazines. And I bought like liters and liters of aloe vera juice, and I would have like a shot of this aloe vera juice to help cleanse my gut, in inverted commas. And I would go on detoxes. And I really wish that I knew that actually it was about what you add into your diet that matters most, and nourishing and things like, even for example, from a skin point of view, it's more about what you put on your skin rather than take away. So, I was of the clan where you used to literally strip everything off your skin. So yeah, I was all about taking away from the diet, a shot of aloe vera juice. Oh my God, it was gross as well. And actually it actually caused some bad side effects, and I made myself quite poorly off it. So yeah, I really wish that I knew that. But that's one of the reasons that got me into nutrition. And then I realized I threw away all my cuttings from magazines that I used to keep. And I just thought, oh my God, I've been fooled all these years.
Oh, I love that. And a great way to wrap up, because I think when we think of nutrition, it's so easy to think subtraction and taking foods away. And we definitely run that risk in 2024 and beyond of literally being left with nothing but water, because every food gets labeled into a bad category, when in reality it's like, okay, what can I add in? And thinking about your nutrition from a place of addition and abundance as opposed to scarcity and subtraction. Nichola, keep doing what you're doing. The book, for those who want to check it out, is linked directly in the description for anyone that is looking for that 4-week plan to kind of get you up and running with the reduction of ultra processed foods. And go follow the Instagram page as well, and the website, and all the other handles will be linked too. Nichola, thank you so much again. I'll chat to you soon.
Thank you, Brian. Bye.
There you have it, dietitian Nichola Ludlam-Rain on the real problem with ultra-processed foods, eating healthy and not losing weight, and the 3 types of hunger: head, heart, and stomach. Today's podcast was brought to you by my BKF online program, which is my coaching program. I'll put that link for that in the description below. And I'm also going to read out a review from Apple Podcasts. If you haven't left a rating or a review for the podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts, that would be amazing if you could do that off the back of this episode. And just let me know what you're enjoying, today's episode or any other previous episodes, and it helps massively with the growth of the show. Today's podcast comes from Kate Welch. Gold dust of information. I've been listening to Brian's episodes for years now, and I've learned so much from him and his guest speakers. Highly recommend it to everyone to learn about all things health, nutrition, lifestyle, and mindset. 5 stars. Kate, thank you so much for the review, and I'm going to go through and try and do one of these each week going forward. I tend to forget things, but I've made a note to try and remind myself of this. So if you can leave a rating and a review off the back of this episode, like Kate's, or similar to what you enjoy with the podcast, that would be amazing. Thank you so much for listening. That's everything from me from this week's episode. Catch you next Monday.